pike is one of the most efficient predators in freshwater. It is fast, precise, and almost never misses. Drop a minnow into a tank with a pike, and the outcome is not a question. It is a schedule. So a group of researchers did exactly that. They dropped minnows into a tank with a pike. The pike ate them immediately, exactly as expected. Then they did something different. They dropped more minnows into the tank, but this time they separated them from the pike with a clear glass partition. The pike could see the minnows. It could track them. It lunged again and again at prey it could see, but could not reach. It hit the glass every time. After a few weeks, the researchers removed the partition. The minnows swam freely through the tank. They drifted within inches of the pike. The pike did not move. It starved to death, surrounded by food it had decided was impossible to reach. This is the Pike Effect, and it is not really about fish. The experiment itself is straightforward enough that it has been repeated in classrooms and behavioral labs for decades. The pike learns an association. Glass between it and the minnows means the minnows are unreachable. That association forms quickly, reinforces with every failed lunge, and eventually calcifies into something the pike's nervous system treats as permanent fact. When the fact changes, the pike does not update. It keeps the old rule even after the rule no longer applies. Even after the rule is actively killing it. The information that the glass is gone does not reach the part of the pike that decides whether to try. Behavioral scientists call this learned helplessness when they're talking about rats. They call it a cognitive trap when they're talking about humans. They call it the Pike Effect when they're talking about organizations. The label changes. The mechanism does not. In 1967, a psychologist named Martin Seligman was running experiments on dogs at the University of Pennsylvania. The setup was deliberately uncomfortable. Dogs were placed in a harness and given mild electric shocks they could not escape or predict. Seligman wanted to study fear conditioning. What he found instead was something he had not been looking for at all. After a period of inescapable shocks, the dogs were moved to a different chamber, a two-sided box with a low barrier in the middle. On one side, the floor could be electrified. The dog could escape simply by stepping over the barrier to the other side. Almost every dog from the first phase refused to try. They lay down. They whimpered. A few made weak initial movements and then stopped. When the shock came, they absorbed it passively, the same way they had learned to absorb it in the harness. The barrier was 6 inches high. The other side was right there. The dogs had learned that their actions did not produce outcomes, and that learning did not stay local to the harness. It generalized. It became their operating assumption about the world. Seligman named it learned helplessness. He spent the next 2 decades documenting its effects in animals, then in humans, and eventually in clinical depression, where he found the cognitive fingerprint was nearly identical. The pike, the dogs, the pattern was the same. When effort repeatedly fails to change outcomes, the nervous system stops generating effort, not out of laziness, out of logic. The organism learned something true, and it is applying that truth long after the truth has expired. The Pike Effect became the business version of this idea. In the 1970s and 1980s, organizational researchers started noticing that companies had their own version of the glass partition. Industries that had dominated their markets for decades began failing not because their resources disappeared, not because their talent left, but because they kept applying rules that had stopped being true. The rule said, this is how our customers buy. This is what our competitors cannot do. This is where our margins live. This is the wall. They lunged at the same spaces. They kept hitting glass that was no longer there. The American railroad industry is the cleanest example. For the first half of the 20th century, the railroads were the most powerful transportation companies in the world. They moved everything. They could not imagine a future in which they did not move everything, because they never had. When cars became affordable and highways were built and commercial aviation came online, the railroads did not pivot. They did not decide they were in the transportation business. They decided they were in the railroad business and that the railroad business was what it had always been. The glass had been removed. They kept not lunging. By the 1970s, most of the great American railroad companies were bankrupt or absorbed. Not because train tracks stopped working, because the executives in those boardrooms were pike in a tank, running behavioral software that had been written in a world that no longer existed. The most uncomfortable version of the Pike Effect is the personal one, because the glass partition almost always goes in early. A child tries to perform and is told, explicitly or implicitly, that they are not the kind of person who performs. A young professional proposes an idea and is shut down publicly enough that the lesson lands with physical weight. Someone applies for something they want, gets rejected, applies again, gets rejected, and somewhere in that sequence, the nervous system writes a rule. that is not available to you. The rule protects them. It is genuinely protective. It stops them from repeatedly absorbing the same pain. The nervous system is not being irrational. It is being efficient. The problem is that efficiency becomes permanence. The partition that was real in one environment, at one age, under one specific set of conditions, gets carried forward as a fixed feature of reality. The person stops trying not because the thing is impossible, but because they completed enough trials in a particular tank to conclude it was. They move through rooms full of minnows. They do not lunge. Seligman spent the second half of his career working on the reversal. His early learned helplessness research was bleak. The follow-up was not. What he found was that learned helplessness was neither permanent nor universal. It could be unlearned, but it could not be unlearned the way it was learned, and it could not be argued out, reasoned out, or wished out. The dogs did not recover because someone explained to them that the barrier was gone. They recovered when researchers physically guided them across the barrier, repeatedly, until the experience of successful action overwrote the prediction of failure. The body had to move through the obstacle. The mind followed. This is why insight alone tends not to be enough. You can recognize the Pike Effect operating in your own life with perfect clarity. You can name the original tank, identify the glass, trace exactly when the lunging stopped, and still not update. The cognitive knowledge that the partition is gone is not the same as the embodied knowledge. They are stored differently. They retrieve differently. Under stress, under stakes, under the conditions that actually matter, the older and deeper learning tends to win. The update has to be earned through action, through a lunge that lands differently than every previous lunge predicted it would. There's a version of the Pike Effect that no individual creates for themselves. Institutions create it for the people inside them. A system that consistently punishes initiative teaches people that initiative is punished. A workplace that rewards the appearance of effort over the production of results teaches people to perform effort. A family that responds to vulnerability with criticism teaches people that vulnerability is dangerous. The tank was built by someone else. The glass was installed by someone else. The organism inside is just running the software the environment wrote. This is what makes the Pike Effect genuinely hard to resolve at scale. Because the same mechanism that produces helpless individuals also produces helpless organizations, helpless departments, helpless teams, entire groups of people who have collectively concluded, through shared experience, that the thing they want is on the other side of glass. Some of it still is. Not all of it. The work is figuring out which is which. The minnows in the tank with the pike kept swimming. They did not know about the learned association. They did not know that the predator 6 inches away had decided they were unreachable. They were just minnows moving through available water. The pike watched them and did nothing. It had been one of the most efficient predators in freshwater. The glass had been gone for weeks. The only partition left was the one the pike had finished building inside itself, assembled lunge by lunge, failure by failure, until it was indistinguishable from the walls of the tank. What you stopped trying for is worth looking at again. Not because the glass is definitely gone, but because you decided it wasn't. And you decided that a long time ago, and the tank you were in then is not the tank you are in now. The lunge costs less than you think. Try it and find out.